The room went silent. Then they laughed. I did not. I stood at the edge of the ballroom with a glass of champagne in my hand, watching my mother's face. She was sitting at table 22, the last table before the kitchen doors, the one that smelled like dish soap and garlic bread, the one where the folding chairs had been set up because someone had run out of the real ones. She was wearing the blue dress she had bought 3 months ago, the one she had shown me on a video call, spinning in her living room like a teenager. She had saved for that dress. She had driven 40 minutes to the mall twice before she found it. And my future mother-in-law had just leaned toward the woman beside her, loud enough for the nearest 4 tables to hear, and said, "That must be the cleaning lady's mother. Someone forgot to tell her this wasn't a buffet." The woman beside her covered her mouth. Then she laughed. Then the table laughed. My mother did not look up. She adjusted her napkin on her lap and stared at the centerpiece like she was trying to memorize the flowers. I knew that look. I had seen it my whole life, the look she wore when she was deciding whether the thing that just happened was worth the energy of reacting to. She had perfected that look, working double shifts at the hospital for 22 years. She had worn it at every parent-teacher conference, where a teacher looked at her scrubs and assumed she wouldn't understand the vocabulary. She had worn it the first time she met Marcus's family. I should have paid attention then. My name is Diana. I'm 29 years old. I am a structural engineer. I have a master's degree from Georgia Tech and a professional license in 3 states. I have worked on 14 commercial projects, 2 of which are currently visible on the Atlanta skyline if you know where to look. None of that mattered to the Whitfield family. What mattered was that my mother had raised me alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur on a nurse's salary. What mattered was that she drove a 2011 Honda with a cracked dashboard and a check engine light she refused to fix because she said the car knew its own business. What mattered to the Whitfields was the zip code I grew up in, and the fact that my mother's hands were rough from 30 years of work that actually meant something. I met Marcus 3 years before that dinner. He was charming in the specific way that men who have always been told they are exceptional tend to be, generous with attention, quick to compliment, the kind of person who makes you feel like you are the most interesting person in the room. We met at a conference. He was presenting on commercial real estate acquisitions. I was there representing the engineering firm I worked for. He asked for my card. I gave it to him mostly because I was curious what he would do with it. He called the next morning. For the first year, everything was easy. He was attentive. He remembered things. He asked about my mother by name and listened when I talked about work. He made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like being loved was not something I had to earn in installments. I noticed the first sign at 6 months. We were at dinner with his parents, the first time I met them, and his mother, Patricia, had asked me what my father did. When I explained that my father had not been in the picture since I was 4, she had smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and said, "Oh, how resilient you must be." The way she said resilient made it sound like a category rather than a compliment. Like I was a case study she was filing away. His father, Robert, had not asked me anything. He had talked to Marcus the entire dinner as if I were a +1 who had wandered in from another event. I told myself it was nerves. First meeting. These things take time. My mother had raised me to give people the benefit of the doubt, especially when the doubt was inconvenient. The second sign came at 1 year. Marcus and I had gotten serious, and his family had started including me in their larger gatherings. I began to understand the Whitfield family structure. Robert Whitfield had built a commercial property management company from a single strip mall his father had left him. He had grown it into something real, 30 properties across 5 states, a portfolio worth somewhere north of $40 million on paper. Patricia had never worked inside the company but had very specific opinions about everything within it. Marcus was the heir apparent, the oldest son, the one the whole family structure was organized around. I also began to understand that the Whitfields had an opinion about the kind of woman Marcus should be with. She should come from money, or at least from a family with a name. She should have the right kind of degree from the right kind of school, not Georgia Tech, apparently, but somewhere with a longer legacy and a better tailgate reputation. She should be decorative at events and quiet in meetings. She should understand that marrying into the Whitfield family was itself a form of achievement and should conduct herself accordingly. I was none of those things. Patricia made this clear in the way that wealthy women with good manners make things clear through omission, through the half-second pause before a compliment, through the questions that were really observations. "Oh, you took out loans for graduate school?" That must have been stressful. It's so impressive how you've gotten this far without connections. Marcus says you're very independent. That's an interesting quality in a partner. Marcus laughed these things off. He said his mother meant well. He said she would come around. He said the most important thing was that he loved me and his parents' opinions were just opinions. I believed him longer than I should have. I should tell you the thing I did not tell Marcus for the first 2 years of our relationship. I should tell you what I did not even tell my mother until much later. My firm had been working with a private equity group to develop a mixed-use project in Buckhead. During the course of that work, I had been introduced to a man named Gerald Chen, a quiet and methodical investor who was looking to diversify into commercial real estate. Gerald and I had spent 6 months talking about the market, about structural risk, about which developers in Atlanta actually knew what they were doing, and which ones were trading on inherited reputation. I had introduced Gerald to Robert Whitfield. I had vouched for the Whitfield portfolio personally. I had provided analysis, 80 pages of it, that gave Gerald the confidence to invest $3 million into a joint venture with Whitfield Property Management. Robert Whitfield did not know this. Gerald had insisted on anonymity at that stage. He was private in the way that serious money tends to be private. The introduction had come through my firm, through my name attached to a memo, but Robert had never connected the dots between his son's girlfriend and the financial lifeline that had come in at exactly the right moment, the year their largest property had flooded and their insurance dispute was still in litigation. I knew. My mother knew. Gerald knew. No one at the Whitfield table at that anniversary gala knew. Marcus and I had gotten engaged 4 months before the gala. The engagement had been his idea. And I had said yes because I loved him, and because I had convinced myself that the family dynamic would shift once I was officially family. Patricia had hugged me with both arms and said she was thrilled. Robert had shaken my hand and said Marcus had chosen well. I had chosen to accept these gestures at face value. The gala was the Whitfield family's annual celebration, 20 years of the company, 200 guests, the kind of event that exists to remind everyone in the room how far the Whitfields had come. Marcus had asked me to invite my mother. He said he wanted her to feel included. I had called my mother 3 times in the week before the event. I had described the venue, the dress code, the guest list. She had listened carefully and then said, "Baby, are you sure about this family?" I had said yes. She had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, I trust you." She had worn the blue dress. She had driven herself because I had gone early with Marcus to help with logistics. I had assumed she would be seated at a table near the front. I had not checked the seating chart because Marcus had told me his assistant handled it. The assistant had put my mother at table 22. When I found out when I walked through the room 20 minutes before the dinner started and saw her sitting there alone, reading the menu like a woman who was deciding how much to enjoy an evening that had already told her she was not expected, I had gone straight to Marcus. "Why is my mother at table 22? He was straightening his tie in the reflection of a window. He glanced at me in the glass. The seating was complicated. A lot of business contacts needed to be near my father. "She's next to the kitchen. Diana." His voice had a patience in it that was not actually patience. It was the tone of someone who had decided in advance that this conversation was going to be unreasonable. "There are 200 people here. We can't seat everyone at the front. She's my mother. She drove an hour to be here. I'll talk to her after dinner. She'll be fine." He turned and smiled at me in a way that was meant to close the subject. "You look beautiful. Let's just have a good night." I went back to the ballroom. I sat down at the head table. I watched my mother sit at table 22 and unfold her napkin and arrange herself with the dignity she had been arranging herself with her entire life. And I told myself that after the dinner, I would make it right. I would bring her up front. I would introduce her to everyone. I would fix it. Then Patricia leaned toward the woman beside her and said what she said about the cleaning lady's mother. And the table laughed. And my mother adjusted her napkin and looked at the centerpiece. I set down my champagne glass. I did it quietly. I placed it on the white tablecloth and I pushed back my chair and I stood up. Marcus put his hand on my arm. "Diana." I looked at his hand. Then I looked at him. "Don't," he said quietly. "Not here." "Okay," I said. I walked across the ballroom, not to table 22, to the front of the room, to the podium where the microphone stood waiting for Robert Whitfield's anniversary speech. I picked it up. 200 people turned to look at me. I said, "I'm sorry to interrupt the cocktail hour. My name is Diana. Most of you know me as Marcus's fiancé. Some of you know me from the engineering work I've done across the city. A few of you know me from a different context, and I'm going to speak to that in a moment." The room was very quiet. I could hear the kitchen doors. I want to first say something about the woman at table 22. Her name is Ruth. She has worked as a registered nurse for 22 years. She raised me alone. She paid for my education by working double shifts, and she never once suggested that my ambitions were too large for my circumstances. I paused. She was seated at the last table in this room, next to the kitchen, and 6 minutes ago, she was called, within her earshot, a cleaning lady. I want everyone in this room to know that my mother is the most accomplished person in this building, and she will be taking my seat at the front table for the rest of this evening. Patricia had gone the color of old chalk. Marcus was standing. Robert had not moved. I looked at Gerald Chen, who was seated 3 tables from the front. He had accepted the invitation because I had asked him to come. He gave me the smallest nod. "There is one more thing," I said. 3 years ago, Whitfield Property Management experienced a significant liquidity problem following the Piedmont Avenue flood litigation. The capital infusion that stabilized the company during that period, $3 million in bridge financing through a joint venture structured in December of that year, came from an investor I introduced to this company. I provided the analysis that made that investment possible. I personally vouched for this family's operation when I had no obligation to do so and no financial incentive at the time. The room had the specific stillness of people realizing that the conversation they were in was much larger than they had understood. I am telling you this not to embarrass anyone. I set the microphone down on the podium. I am telling you this because I would like my mother to know that her daughter's value was never invisible, even when certain people in this room chose not to see it. I walked back across the ballroom. I stopped at table 22. I pulled out the chair next to my mother and sat down. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were very bright. "I told you 3 years ago," she said, quietly. "I know," I said. "You were right." She reached over and took my hand. We sat there together while the room tried to figure out what to do with itself. Marcus came to the table. He stood across from us and his face was doing several things at once: embarrassment, anger, and something underneath both of those that might have been the beginning of understanding, though it came too late to matter. "Diana," he said, "can we talk?" "We can talk," I said. "But I want my mother to hear everything." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the calm of a woman who has been tired and proven right about the same thing for a very long time. He sat down. The conversation that followed was not loud. Loud would have been easier. It was the kind of quiet, careful conversation where someone takes apart what they built and looks at the pieces and tries to understand how they thought it was solid. Marcus said he was sorry. He said his family was difficult and he had been trying to manage everyone. He said he should have put the seating together himself. He said he loved me and he did not want to lose me. I listened to all of it. I had learned to listen from my mother, who had learned that listening completely is different from agreeing. When he was done, I said, "Your mother called my mother a cleaning lady in front of 200 people, and you watched it happen. Before that, for 3 years, you watched your family treat my mother like an inconvenience, and you called it complicated. That is not a thing I can fix by having a quiet conversation at a table." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I need you to understand what you chose before I can tell you whether I believe you would choose differently." I gave him back his ring that night. Not in the ballroom. In the parking lot, while my mother waited in the blue dress by her 2011 Honda with the cracked dashboard, watching the stars with the patience of a woman who has learned that outcomes take time. I placed the ring in his palm and closed his fingers around it. He did not argue. I think some part of him had understood, somewhere around the moment I picked up the microphone, that he had been choosing for 3 years and had not been honest with himself about what he was choosing. The weeks that followed were not simple. They never are. Gerald Chen, as it turned out, had been watching the Whitfield situation carefully. He was a meticulous man. The joint venture agreement we had structured 3 years earlier contained standard performance clauses, benchmarks the Whitfield operation was required to hit in exchange for the continued capital arrangement. Robert Whitfield had missed 2 of them quietly, assuming Gerald's patience was a character trait rather than a strategic position. It was not. Gerald called a meeting 10 days after the gala. I know because he told me afterward. He sat across from Robert Whitfield in a conference room in Midtown and explained, in the language of contract and default triggers, that the joint venture was being restructured. The $3 million in bridge capital would be recalled on the original terms. The revenue-sharing arrangement on 2 of the Whitfield properties, the ones that had performed best since the infusion, would revert to the joint venture entity, which Gerald controlled. Robert Whitfield had built his company on a foundation he did not fully understand, and now the foundation was being reorganized. I am not a person who takes pleasure in watching things collapse. My mother raised me to build, not to destroy. But I will tell you what I felt sitting in my apartment the evening after Gerald called to tell me about the meeting. I felt the specific peace of a person who had stopped waiting for someone else to acknowledge what was real. The Whitfields had looked at my mother and seen nothing worth respecting. They had looked at me and seen a convenient addition to a family story they had already written. They had not looked carefully enough at either of us to understand what they were dealing with. That is the thing about deciding someone is beneath you. You stop paying attention to them, and the details you stop paying attention to are the ones that matter. My mother came to visit 3 weeks after the gala. She stayed for a long weekend. We made coffee in the mornings and sat on my balcony and talked the way we had always talked, honestly, without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. She told me about a younger nurse on her floor who reminded her of me at 22, determined and slightly reckless in the best possible way. I told her about a new project I had been offered, a mixed-use development near the waterfront, significant work, the kind of scope I had been building toward. On her last morning, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around her mug. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Why didn't you tell me? About what you did for their company?" I thought about it. I think I was afraid that if you knew, you would tell me to get out sooner than I was ready to. She smiled, slowly. "And would that have been so bad?" "No," I said. "But I needed to get out in my own way." She nodded. She understood that. She had always understood the difference between protecting someone and clearing the path so they can find their own way through. She hugged me at the door before she left, held on for an extra moment the way she does when she is deciding whether there is something more to say. Then she let go and picked up her bag and walked to the car with the broken dashboard and the check engine light that she said knew its own business. I watched her pull out of the parking garage. I went back inside and opened my laptop. The waterfront project proposal was waiting. I started reading. The conference room I walked into for the first presentation was on the 31st floor of a building I had helped certify for occupancy 4 years earlier. The developer shook my hand and said he had heard about my work. I said I appreciated the opportunity. He asked how I had gotten into structural engineering. I told him my mother had taught me that structures either hold weight or they don't. And the most important thing is to know which one you're standing on before you commit to it. He laughed. He thought I was being poetic. I was being precise. My mother calls every Sunday morning. We talk for as long as it takes. She tells me about the hospital and her patients and the small negotiations of daily life. I tell her about the projects and the math and the occasional meeting where someone underestimates me for the last time. She always wants to know about the work. She has never stopped being interested in the details. Last Sunday she asked me how the waterfront project was going. I told her we had broken ground. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way she gets when she is proud and does not want to oversell it. Then she said, "Tell me everything." So I did.